In this slide cast, we're going to look at the second part of the tender process, the tendering process. This is where you'll recall in the previous slide cast, we looked at the submission. So the tender period ended with the tenderers submitting their tender bids. Now we're talking about what do we do with those tender bids. So the first thing we do is check and evaluate them. We'll write a tender report. The principal then decides if is he going to accept it or not. If he accepts it, then we form a contract by sending the tender acceptance letter. He might reject all tenders, in which case we either re-tender or we redesign it, so that it might be, the price was too high and we need to redesign it, so it's going to be a lower price, or he might cancel the project altogether. So this usually happens if the prices are all too high. So let's look at the tender check and evaluation. So remember, the tender submissions, the tender bids have been submitted, they have been opened. Sometimes that's done publicly, sometimes it's done privately. Whatever, when they're opened, they need to be recorded. So the first thing that happens after the tenders are submitted, they are opened, and you do it, it's a formal process. You sit there and there are witnesses there. So you open up the envelope, you state who the tenderer is, how much they've submitted their price for, and someone writes that down. And then you open the next ones and you keep on going until you've got a list of tenderers that have submitted their bids and their prices. And then everyone who's witnessed it signs it, and that is a formal document. The idea of that process is that you don't miss any tenders, you don't lose any. If one gets lost, there's a record that it was actually submitted. Then the consultant usually goes away and processes it. So he does an arithmetic check. He checks whether the arithmetic's right. We'll look at that in the next slide. He will check whether there are tags. Once again, we'll look at that in the next slide. And then he will evaluate it. That evaluation might be just the engineer, the consultant alone, or there might be a committee with representatives from the client and the consultant team. So let's look at that tender check in a little bit more detail. Arithmetic check. Now this is what is called a schedule of quantities. This is the way that the contractors normally submit their price. When they put in their tender bid, they will say we will do the work for this price, 46,500. But normally we have a schedule of quantities which breaks that number down, and that is quite a useful thing. We'll be looking at this later on in the course. So what you want to do, and in the tender document, these ones, item, description, unit, and quantity, that's all that's provided. The next two, rate and amount, are what is filled in by the contractor. So what you want to do if you're the consultant is check and make sure that they've got the arithmetic right. So the amount is the quantity times the rate equals that. So you'll be checking every one of these. This times this, does it equal that? That times that, does it equal that? And then all of these added together form the contract price. So you're adding them all together and making sure they're right. And surprisingly, contractors make mistakes in this arithmetic all the time. They are not allowed to change their price if they've made a mistake. So this bottom line has to stay where it is. So the contractor is offered a choice. The tenderer who's made an arithmetic error is offered a choice. The consultant will say, you've made an arithmetic error, so maybe he sort of multiplied 800 by 8 and ended up with $640. Okay, you will tell him what the mistake was. You will say you've got two choices. You can either withdraw your tender now, or you can let that mistake lie. In other words, that tender price still stays the same, and the contractor has to work with that price that he submitted in there. And usually they'll choose to stay with it. Tags are conditions set by the contractor that change the contract agreement. You're looking for this because the client has said what he wants done, and he set it out in the tender document. He says these are the conditions of the contract agreement, and that the contractor may decide, or the tenderer may decide, to alter that contractual agreement. So for example, there might be something like the rate of $8 per square meter, that thing offered there, is based on the topsoil layer being 100 mils thick. If the topsoil layer is actually thicker than 100 mils, then that rate will increase. So what the contractor has done is he's looked at this, the tenderer has looked at this and said, there's a risk that I'll be removing more topsoil than what I thought I would, and I want to be paid for it. If he didn't do that, then he could be removing 200 millimeters thick of topsoil and still being paid the same amount. So he could be removing twice as much topsoil and still being paid the same. Notice that he doesn't say that if it's thinner than 100 mils, we'll do it for a lesser rate. If it's only 50 mils, he still gets $8 per meter. So it's the way you phrase it. So the consultant is looking for these tags, and he's asking himself, is this tag acceptable? Does it place undue risk on the client? Oftentimes he'll go to the client and say, these are the tags, are they acceptable to you? If they are acceptable, then nothing else is done and it becomes part of the contract agreement. If the client is not happy with it, then the consultant goes back and tries to negotiate a condition that is agreeable. So he's negotiating with the contractor. So he tries to negotiate an acceptable agreement. If the contractor and the client cannot agree on what that how that tag should be, then the contractor's bid will be ruled non-complying, which means that it is not considered any further. The contractor will not be able to win the tender work. So essentially you take the contractor's bid and you chuck it in the bin if you can't reach an agreement on tags. The other thing you're looking for is front loading. So it might be that the contractor puts really high prices for the work that's being done early on. That means he gets a whole lot of money in the early progress payments and less in the following bits, because the contractors want money early rather than later. So you're looking for that in front loading. It's not illegal, but it is a bit dodgy, so you're always looking out for it. So now we're looking at the evaluation, and when we're looking at the evaluation, we're looking for the price. Obviously we want it done for a reasonable price, but we're not necessarily picking up the lowest price. We are looking for a contractor that can do the job properly. So that means he's got adequate resources, relevant experience, good track record. Track record means how has he done on other jobs. So you're talking to people who he's worked for before. Said, did he do a good job? Was he easy to work with? Did he try to rip you off? So all those sort of things. Stable company, is the contracting company going to go bankrupt halfway through the project? You don't want that to happen. And the methodology, are they going to do the work in a way that is acceptable to you? For example, if they're talking about driving piles, are they going to bring in a massive great pile driver which is going to make a whole lot of noise and disturb the neighbours? Maybe that's unacceptable to you. So you're looking at all of these. So these are called attributes. This is the price attribute, and the rest of these are called non-price attributes. So an attribute is a quality or feature that is an inherent part of something or something. In other words, things you need to know about the contractor. And in an engineering contract, we're looking for these particular attributes in our contractor. So there are three different types of tender evaluation methods. So these are the different ways that we can compare each one of those bids that we get. The first one is lowest price. In other words, we only consider the price. We don't really care about the non-price attributes, it's all about the price. So you could get a real cowboy that can't do the job properly, but he submits the lowest price and he wins. So to avoid that, you might look at, set out some attributes and then assess the contractors, the tenderers on that. So you say, has this person got good experience or not? Yes or no, pass or fail. So you go through all the tenders and you look at each one of the tenderers' attributes, and if any of them have a fail for any one of those attributes, then you don't consider them anymore. You take their bid, you throw it in the bin. The ones that all have passes on those attributes, they meet your requirements, they are considered on price, and the lowest one of those conforming tenders wins. The last one is weighted attribute, which is similar to this one, except that you grade those attributes. In this case, it's pass or fail. In the case of the weighted attribute, you give them numbers, between 1 and 100. So it might be that a tenderer has really good experience, and another one has just marginal experience, but they both get a pass. In this case, in the weighted attribute one, the tenderer that has the minimal experience gets a lower score than the one that's got the really good experience. So that allows you to distinguish between how good each tenderer is in each one of those attributes. Just looking at those, the lowest price is just looking at price, lowest price conforming is looking at the price and non-conforming attributes, and the weighted attribute is looking at price, non-conforming, non-price attributes, and weights them as well. So that's a little table that summarizes what we talked about before. Once we have done the evaluation, we need to put it all into a report so the client can have a look at it. So the tender reports is to inform the client of the process and to recommend the preferred tenderer. It's good to put it in a formal form so that if anyone comes back and says, how did you guys arrive at this decision, there is a document that shows how you arrived at it. So you're describing your process, you're saying what was submitted, any tags and how they were resolved, what the prices were. Remember, we had an engineer's estimate at the end of the design, so you're comparing it with the engineer's estimate, saying, yeah, these prices all look fair, they're what we would have expected, or they might be all above what the engineer's estimate is, in which case it's not what we thought. You're looking for things like front loading. You talk about the evaluation process and the results, and then you make a recommendation. You say, we recommend that you hire this one. The client may or may not decide to accept that. So the last step in the process is that the client reviews the tender report and says, yes, I agree, I want to accept your recommendation and hire this person, or they might say, no, I disagree, I want to hire this one. So they don't have to do what's recommended in the tender report, but usually they do. So the last thing that happens is an acceptance letter is sent. It is sent to the tenderer who the client wants to hire. It accepts their offer. It says, so the offer was what was contained in the tenderer's bid. And we say, we accept your offer. And when they say that, it forms a contractual relationship, provided it's unconditional. It's not, we accept your offer if you agree to drop the price by $100,000. That's not an unconditional acceptance. You include the date, and then when the works is going to start, when the works is going to finish, the contractor's name, and then you do administration stuff like tell them to put their insurances in place, you tell them who the engineer and engineer's representative is going to be, and you hand over, and when the site's going to be handed over. So the thing to realize is that when this letter is received by the tenderer, he has now formed a contractual relationship, and that tenderer, the winning tenderer, becomes the contractor in that contract.